to focus on a presentation called The Limits of Artificial Intelligence as Established by a Multi-Layered Symmetry-Based Model of Light. I gave this presentation a few weeks ago at a conference, and it's a rather long name for a conference. It was the 11th Annual IEEE Information Technology, Electronics, and Mobile Communication Conference that typically takes place in Vancouver, but due to lockdown, it was virtual this year. Now, before I get launched into it, I'd like to pull up the abstract and essentially read the first few lines to just ground us. So reading from the abstract, it has been said that the future of life is about artificial intelligence, and that as AI advances, a point will be reached, the singularity, when humans will no longer have a clue as to what is going on nor why. So that's the current paradigm in thinking about what artificial intelligence may lead to, essentially because with the computing power and the algorithms that are being developed, the thought is that that's going to far outstrip what any human being is capable of. And therefore, the singularity is going to occur where humans are not going to have a clue as to what's going on. Now, on the contrary, continuing to read from the abstract, this article will make the case that the future of life is enabled by the pre-existent complexity that exists in every iota of it. And this pre-existent complexity derives essentially from a multi-layered symmetry-based model of light, from which fundamental layers of matter in life, including the electromagnetic field, quantum particles, atoms, and cells, can be proposed to emerge. So this second point of view is in stark contrast to the current thinking about artificial intelligence. And that's essentially what this paper is focused on, is this stark contrast or this alternative view for what's possible in just the complexity that exists in life itself. And when we think about this, as I'll reach in a few minutes, it's going to set up some natural limits to artificial intelligence if in fact such a paradigm where you have pre-existent complexity deriving from a multi-layered symmetry-based model of light is true. So with that, let's launch into the presentation. And I'll mention also that this presentation, I received an award for Best Presenter, which was nice to do so. I've been presenting papers essentially to do with my work on light for the last few years. And just coincidentally, the last two presentations I gave, for both of those, I received the Best Presenter award, which was nice. So having said that, the way that this presentation is structured, it's in four parts. One is I'm going to introduce the model of light. Second, I'm going to show the kinds of emergences that happen in this computational model of light. Third, I'm going to go over some key points on contemporary AI. And fourth, just summarize the differences essentially between the computational model of light and the computational model as it exists in the contemporary thinking of artificial intelligence. So coming to the multi-layered symmetry-based model of light, what we see here is a matrix, and there's multiple rows in this matrix, but I'm going to focus at the top. So the top row here, essentially, we have a reality which I propose is light's native state, where light travels infinitely fast. And we see that this traveling of light infinitely fast creates four aspects or properties to that reality, which we just call presence, power, knowledge, harmony. But let me just elaborate so that we're grounded as to why that's the case. So imagine we have a volume of light, or a large volume rather, and at the center of that volume is a source of light. And imagine that you turn that light source on. Now, since it travels infinitely fast, it's going to fill up that volume instantaneously, so that light is going to be present everywhere, and therefore there's this property of presence. If anything not of the nature of light arises, then light's going to overpower it, so there's this property of power. Since everything is recorded in this fabric of light, whatever emerges, whatever disappears, light's going to have a knowledge of that volume and therefore the property of knowledge. And since everything exists in the fabric or nature of light, there's going to be an implicit harmony. So going back to this, essentially, we see that when light travels infinitely fast, there's this reality that's created that has these four properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. Now, the second row you see here with the down arrow, that essentially signifies a quantization function, so that this subtle information that's depicted by presence, power, knowledge, harmony, when light projects itself at a slower speed that's depicted by the subscript k, which is lower than infinity, but still very, very, very high, then it's imagined that these four properties display or materialize into more of the richness of what each of them are. So we have the emergence of four sets, and these sets are a set of presence, a set of power, a set of knowledge, and a set of harmony. And you can imagine any one of these sets as having up to infinite number of elements that display the richness of that single property that we had called either presence, power, knowledge, or harmony. Now, in this subsequent row, there's another quantization that occurs, this RCN, and that further materializes this information that exists in sets in such a way that there's an infinite number of permutations and combinations in which unique combinations occur of the elements in each of the four sets to create, in fact, an infinite diversity of seeds. And so that's depicted by this line here, where c to the subscript n, where light travels at the speed n that's lower than k, but still above 186,000 miles per second. And the significance of this line is that essentially what it's proposing, that mathematically there's a couple of these quantization functions or transformations that occur that create infinite number of diverse seeds that with a subsequent quantization or projection of light to the known speed of 186,000 miles per second, then create all the vast material diversity with its infinity of difference in this physical form that we recognize. So that's essentially what these layers of this matrix are saying. And then we have also a projection of light that where it exists at zero speed. So the reality would be the opposite of where it exists at infinity. And here, instead of presence, power, knowledge, harmony, we have darkness, weakness, inertia, and chaos. And this too has an influence due to some kind of quantization function on this physical layer, so that we can see, in fact, that there's a arbitration, a real-time arbitration, a persistent arbitration that's occurring at the quantum level, where there's many different influences from antecedent layers of light that are faster than the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, and also from this layer of light where light's imagined to exist at zero speed. Now, whether this is true or not is not the point here. The point here is that there are different conceptual spaces that are set up in this model using the speed of light as a variable that allow us to think about what these conceptual spaces might look like. And mathematically, these conceptual spaces then allow us to construct all the infinite diversity that we experience here as matter, life, and as other emergences that are occurring and that will continue to occur. And that really is the power of this multi-layered symmetry-based model of light. It's symmetrical because if we look at it in a little more detail, we'll see that there are four properties that, of course, were proposed to exist where light travels infinitely fast. But then it's these same four properties that continue to create the reality even as light projects itself at different speeds. So there's a symmetry where we perceive these same four qualities from a different point of view. So they remain the same, but we're perceiving them differently, primarily because the speed of light is proposed to be different. And therefore, it's a multi-layered symmetry-based model of light. Now, there's consequences to this kind of conceptual space that I argue is, in fact, could very well be a reality and a single light-based edifice behind things. And in my point of view, the proof, or rather, the really, if what we see emerge in matter and light also has a fourfold reality that, in fact, can derive from this kind of persistent computation that's taking place, then there's a possibility that this model is a legitimate model for how things emerge at the material and life levels. So let's look at the emergences from this multi-layered symmetry-based computational model of light. So we can see here four different constructs. One is the field for the electromagnetic field. Then we have quantum particles, we have atoms and cells. But you'll notice right away, as you look at these, that the reality at each of these levels has the four properties that we saw that exist at light traveling infinitely fast of knowledge, power, presence, and harmony. And let's see specifically how this plays out at each of these levels. So starting with the electromagnetic field level, we can make the case that we know that the electromagnetic field is perceivable to us by the electromagnetic spectrum, and we have infinite variety of wavelengths and frequencies. And if we think about any wavelength or any frequency, then essentially a particular wavelength or a particular frequency gives rise to a particular kind of application and behavior. So for example, we have radio waves, we've got microwaves, we've got ultraviolet, visible light, infrared, X-rays, gamma rays that are all different depictions or different emergences from that one field. But the point is that we can see that there's an archetype of a vast variety of possibilities that exist, and that's a function of essentially frequency and wavelength, or frequency or wavelength. And so that vast archetype gives us a glimpse into the aspect of knowledge, so light's property of knowledge that's materializing at the electromagnetic field through this array of possibilities, archetypal array of possibilities that shows up as frequencies or wavelengths. When we think about light's materialization as power, then we know that there's a correlation between the frequency of light and power, and there's a well-known formula where you multiply frequency by Planck's constant to arrive at the power that can be generated by a certain subspectrum of light. When we think about the light's materialization as harmony, then we can simply think about the constant speed of light that, in my perception, is intentional, and it being constant allows a lot of variety to arise in it, and therefore it creates the basis of harmony. And if we think about Einstein's famous equation equal to mc squared, and we substitute the E with the hv here, then essentially we have the mass potential that could be determined by a particular frequency in light. And so that gives us insight into how presence materializes in the electromagnetic spectrum. So we see that we have these four aspects that were proposed to exist, and that due to computational the persistent computational reality that's being arbitrated is going to create emergences that are architected by these four aspects of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And we see this first such architecture that's cohesive, showing up at the electromagnetic field itself. Now, when we look at the quantum particles, which are a more advanced emergence in a manner of speaking, again, we see that light's properties of knowledge, power, presence, and harmony can be correlated or in fact materialized as what we call quarks, leptons, bosons, and Higgs bosons. So I'm going to give you one quick example here. When we think about quarks, we know that quarks uniquely makes up protons, and we know that the number of protons in a nucleus uniquely determines the atomic number of an element. And we know that the atomic number of an element uniquely determines the behavior of an element and what it stands for, therefore its knowledge. And so we can see that knowledge is materializing as quark. So similarly, power materializes as leptons, harmony materializes as bosons. And as example, we know that bosons are required for any other essentially quantum particles to collaborate or to combine to create a greater wholes. And we know that presence is a function of the Higgs boson, or Higgs boson in that sense is a materialization of light's aspect of presence. When we look at another layer of complexity, a subsequent emergence from this multi-layered symmetry-based model of light, then we arrive at essentially the periodic table that has 108 known elements that exist in our universe. Many of these, or the latter part of this, perhaps around 15, 16, could be human-made, but certainly naturally occurring elements were 90 plus, 92 or 93. And interestingly, the periodic table itself is divided into four categories: the P shell, D shell, S shell, and F shell. But there's a correlation, and I'll make the case that it's light's aspect of knowledge that materializes as P shell elements, light's aspect of presence as D shell, light's aspect of power as S shell, and light's aspect of harmony as F shell. And to give you a couple of quick examples here, we know that, for example, in the P shell elements, we have silicon and carbon, silicon being the basis of computing machinery, carbon being the basis of life, and also, therefore, of the inherent intelligence or mentality that exists in life. And if we think about, for example, hydrogen and helium that are S shell elements, we know that they're responsible for a massive nuclear fusion that powers the suns, and therefore you can see that power is manifesting through these S shell elements. Now, if we move to this next layer of complexity of cells, any living cell, we find again that there's four molecular plans that animate any cell. These are nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and polysaccharides. But if we ask what they function for, we can see that, in fact, nucleic acids is a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. Proteins is a materialization of light's aspect of presence. Lipids, a materialization of light's aspect of harmony, and polysaccharides, a materialization of light's aspect of power. So the point being that this persistent quantum level arbitration is pushing to the surface more and more complex forms of matter in life that all maintain this architecture. And so when we look back at this model, we really have to pause and think, what it really is incredibly intelligent. And it's creating something that you can't really tell what it's going to create next. So the one commonality is that when we look at these emergences here, then we can see that there's richness, there's a subsequent richness. So for example, from this manifestation of knowledge, power, harmony, and presence to the manifestation in cells, we know, for example, like there are over 30,000 different proteins in the cell itself, which means that that set of presence has diversified and enriched itself. And so we can see that subsequent computation from this light-based model is pushing to the surface more and more richness that exists fundamentally in these properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And so here we have a quick depiction of this very complex, sophisticated, light-based computational model. And as we think about or contrast that with an artificial intelligence model and our contemporary thinking, there's a few things that stand out. One is that contemporary artificial intelligence is based on this notion of substrate independence, meaning that you can have any matter, and so long as that matter has multiple stable states so that it can emulate the process of memory, then it doesn't matter from contemporary AI's point of view what that chunk of matter is. So yes, we use silicon right now to do computations and to essentially create stable states of memory. But I can make the case, if you look back at any of these emergences here, that each of these itself offers stable states so that memory can exist at the field level or at the quantum particle level or at the atom level or at the cell level. So this notion of substrate independence, what it's saying is that essentially it's severing us from the reality of light. And if I contrast it here, in the reality of light, due to some kind of innate intelligence in light, there's something in light that's pushing this fourfold architecture to more and more advanced levels. But in contemporary AI, if you sever it from this edifice of light, which is essentially the thinking right now because it's substrate independent, so it doesn't matter what the substrate is, therefore you're foregoing all that intelligence that exists in light, and therefore any kind of AI that you create by definition can never be as intelligent as a light-based edifice from which all matter, life, and anything beyond it's going to emerge. Now, the other thing is that any matter, from the substrate independence point of view, any matter can be what's called computonium. So far as there are universal building blocks that can be combined to implement any function. So for example, in computing technology, if you have AND gates and NAND gates and NOR gates and OR gates, then you can basically implement a whole variety of functions. But the point also is that when you look at these emergences here that arise from light, again, I could make the case that if we just think about the living cell, for instance, that there's a much richer kind of functionality that's enabled by universal building blocks. So if we probe into the life of proteins and the 30,000 different proteins that exist in a cell, there's such a complexity of building blocks from which functionality can be emulated that it's astounding when you compare it to the small set that we have that creates our current computing technology. So again, the point being that from light itself, there's a complexity that's arising that when we sever from that reality, then the kinds of conceptual and operational space that we create is by definition going to be limited, and that's the case with contemporary AI. So that's what this point is that by virtue of severing from the single light-based edifice from which everything arises, we've restricted conceptual and operational space, and therefore we'll be permuting and computing in a concise space only, and it can only have a set of results and not an infinite display of results. Further, when we think about the notion of intelligence in contemporary AI, then it's been said that essentially if you have a program that can duplicate what any human being, intelligent human being can do, or create something that requires intelligence, then you have intelligence. Now, again, that's a very myopic, in my point of view, a myopic view of intelligence when you compare it to, for example, this light-based edifice, where there's no bounds to what intelligence could be. But here you're severely bounding it, and you're giving the tag of intelligence to something that is just based on a few elements that exist in a limited conceptual and operational space. And so this final point here is that essentially contemporary AI is playing a finite game versus the light-based edifice is set up for an infinite game. And this essentially shows pretty starkly the contrast or the limits of what contemporary AI is set up to create or to be. So in summary, a few points. Contemporary AI uses a substrate independent approach and therefore has a limited conceptual and operational space because it's fundamentally severing itself from a single light-based edifice in which all infinity exists. The kinds of emergences that happen in a light-based edifice, for example, matter, life, mind, display a completely different order of intelligence than what's possible in a limited conceptual and operational space. There's functional richness that's embedded in light that expresses itself in matter, life, mind, and anything else that might emerge. And as we consider each of these emergences of matter, life, mind, we see that this functional richness becomes much more diverse. And there's an interesting final point that I want to make. So there was a book called Light 3.0 that's written by Max Tegmark. And this kind of, I think, summarizes some of the key arguments here. You know, one, if we consider things from his point of view, or that's mainstream artificial intelligence, then he makes the case that you've got Life 1.0, where hardware and software naturally evolved through eons. You got Life 2.0, which is perhaps what we're in right now, where software is designed and hardware evolves. So hardware takes the eons long path. And you have Life 3.0, where software and hardware are both designed. The point I want to make, in summary, is that, in fact, I believe that all of life is nothing but Life 3.0 right from the very start, so long as we focused on this singular light-based edifice that animates everything and from which everything in this model arises. Hello and welcome. I'm Praveer Malik, and today I'm going to give a presentation. It's called A Light-Based Quantum Computational Model of Genetics. And it's actually based on a presentation that I gave a few weeks ago of the same name at the 2020 IEEE International IoT Electronics and Mechatronics Conference that's usually held in Vancouver, but was virtual this year due to COVID. Now, the structure of my presentation is essentially going to be threefold. I'm going to focus on light and its layers. And why light? Because in my point of view, light is central to existence. And this presentation is actually based on a larger body of work, which I call Cosmology of Light. And I'll spend a few minutes to go over the essential model that's central to a cosmology of light. But then also importantly, I'll also spend a little bit of time on genetic type output, which is the natural output from this persistent quantum computational model of light. And I'll finally introduce this idea of the persistent quantum computation, and then I'll wrap this presentation up. So considering this model of light, what you see here on the right-hand side is a multi-layered symmetrical model of light. And there are essentially 5 layers of light over here, depicted by C with subscript infinity, C, K, Cn, Cu, and C0. And what do these represent? Essentially, this layer at the top represents light in its native state, where light travels infinitely fast. And then subsequent layers represent light projected at slower speeds until they precipitate down to the known speed of 186,000 miles per second, which is represented by this rho c to the subscript u. And then also there's a hypothetical rho where light projects itself at speed 0. And in this point of view, essentially it's symmetrical because there's a fourfold reality that exists when light travels infinitely fast. And then we have fourfold realities that exist at each of the subsequent layers of light, which give us a different view of the same reality of light as it exists at that imagined speed where it's projected at either kn 186,000 miles per second or 0. What you'll also see here are quantization functions. These are depicted by the down arrows and the up arrow over here. And essentially what this quantization function is, it can be thought of as taking subtle information. So there's information that exists when light travels infinitely fast, and then it materializes it into something that's less subtle until it becomes completely physical at this known realm of light traveling at 186,000 miles per second. So that's the broad outline of this model of light. And I'm going to go into this in a little more detail in the subsequent slides. So essentially, here, when we think about this infinite layer where light travels infinitely fast, then what we can say about it is that if we assume a volume or a sphere and we have light at its center, and imagine that you're turning on the source of light. Now, since light travels infinitely fast, it's going to be present everywhere in that volume instantaneously. And therefore, there's a quality of presence that becomes prevalent or that surfaces. Similarly, if there's anything not of the nature of light that arises within that volume, it's going to be overcome by the nature of light, and therefore there's a quality of power. Since everything that appears or disappears is happening in the substance of light, light therefore has a knowledge of what's appearing and disappearing, and therefore there's this property of knowledge that arises. And since everything is occurring in this fabric of light, it's connected by this light, and therefore there's a harmony that exists. And so when we think about light traveling infinitely fast, we have these four properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Now, when we think about the information that exists at this layer of light, that information is going to be related to these properties of all presence, all power, all knowledge, and all harmony. And this is simply depicted by the set of presence, power, knowledge, harmony, which have a vast amount of information associated with each of these aspects of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Now, when we go to the next layer, and this is a layer that's occurring now after some initial quantization. And so quantization is taking some subtle information and it's collecting it into a threshold value, which then can materialize itself to a greater degree, and therefore the subtlety becomes less. And what can we expect at this layer? Since this quantization is occurring, therefore we can think of those initial properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony as materializing further or displaying some richness of what each of them stand for. And so this is depicted mathematically as a set of presence. So you can imagine presence being diversified into many, many elements all related to presence. And therefore the information becomes much more diverse or much more particular. And similarly, there's a set of power, a set of knowledge, and a set of harmony. And so when you depict the information that exists at this layer of reality, then it's simply depicted as four sets, which each have up to infinite elements in them that are all related to the core anchor of that set, which is either presence, power, knowledge, or harmony. Now, when we think of the third layer, similarly, there is a further quantization that's happening. And in that quantization, these elements that exist in these four sets are diversifying further or materializing a different face of themselves. So here simply what we can think of this information related to is that it's unique functional elements created from the combination of all the elements in these sets of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And mathematically, that's depicted as a function of all the elements of the set PR, the set PO of power, the set knowledge, and the set of harmony. So you have up to infinite number of diverse elements that then become unique functional seeds that display themselves or become apparent at this layer of reality where light is projected at speed n, which is still above our known speed of 186,000 miles per second. So what we see here is therefore three distinct kinds of information that are all, in a sense, genetic type information because they are specifying certain laws that exist at that particular level of reality. Now, before I get to the layer of CU, I'm going to just focus on this layer where light's projected at zero speed. And we can imagine this layer, which has a reality that's the opposite when light travels infinitely fast. So whereas we had presence, power, knowledge, harmony, here we have the opposite of that. And we can think about that as darkness, weakness, inertia, and chaos. And so the information that exists at this layer has to do with darkness, weakness, inertia, and chaos. So we see very distinct types of information that show themselves at each of these layers of light. And now when we speak about, or when we try and focus on this layer where light travels at 186,000 miles per second, a way to think about this layer is that it is the result of a number of different quantizations that are occurring. And so we have four different quantizations that occur as light projects itself at different speeds, essentially. And this layer here of 186,000 miles per second is the result of a number of these quantization functions. Now, it's depicted as STEG, which actually is space-time energy gravity. And the reason why is because if we think about these infinite number of seeds that exist just in the antecedent layer of light, then in a sense, space becomes an arena for these infinite seeds to materialize and to have the play of whatever is inside these seeds. So space is that arena that allows these seeds to play in a sense. Time becomes a maturity function for these seeds to display the secret of what's inside them. And time can be relative in this point of view because different seeds may mature at different paces. Energy then becomes that property which accompanies each seed and assists in its materialization. So the energy is converted into matter at some point as that maturity is reached. And then gravity can be thought of as a particular kind of coordination between seed and seed or seeds and seeds. And so this is really an aspect of harmony. So what we're seeing here is that just as we had these fourfold realities of presence, power, knowledge, harmony that existed at light traveling infinitely fast and then diversified into the set of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony, therefore displaying another aspect of what presence, power, knowledge, harmony are. So it's the same information, but seen from a different point of view where light's traveling slower. And then at this third layer, where again you're seeing the same information but diversified into infinite number of seeds, again due to light traveling even slower. But the point is that all these seeds now represent a diversity of archetypes, which is nothing other than knowledge. And therefore, you're seeing that space is, in a sense, a precipitation of light's aspect of knowledge. Similarly, time can be thought of as an inevitability whereby what's inside a seed displays itself, and therefore there's this power due to the inevitability. When we think about energy becoming matter, then we can see that this aspect of energy is a precipitation of light's property of presence. And similarly, when we think about gravity, which holds seeds in a certain kind of collectivity, then we know that gravity is, in this point of view, a precipitation of light's aspect of harmony. And so essentially, we're introduced here to this notion of a persistent quantum level computation that, in fact, determines how these seeds then play out or show the fullness that's contained within them over time. Moving forward, essentially, what we've suggested here is a different view of genetics. And when we think about the information that is essentially being subtilized, that exists at this native speed where light travels infinitely fast and then precipitating into various kinds of information that then show themselves very concretely as this fourfold script of space-time, energy, gravity, then we can think of this precipitation or the source of this precipitation as being the origin of genetics. Now, similarly, when we look at this precipitation, then in a sense, it sheds insight into this light-based downward strand. And we know that then what's occurring or shows itself in time is nothing other than a result of this downward strand. And that gives us insight into this symmetrical upward strand that happens in a reverse way. We also get introduced to the notion of these subtle libraries of pre-genetic information, because we have particular kinds of libraries of information existing at each of these layers of light. And we also get introduced to this notion of a material fabric, just as we have DNA and cells that more concretely show genetic information. The proposal here is that prior to the emergence of cells, there's also this genetic type information, and it's being recorded in what we may call a material fabric that perhaps exists at the quantum veil. And the substance or the script of that material fabric is nothing other than this fourfold space-time, energy, gravity, which is depicting for each seed how it's going to behave pretty precisely. And so there's this fourfold script that exists not only at layers that precede the DNA in cells, but also I'll make the proposal that the fourfold script that we see within the DNA has some kind of relationship to space-time, energy, and gravity. So what we also see is this notion of a four-based logic encoding ecosystem. And this should be clear from the symmetrical model of light that's all fourfold based from the very layer where light exists natively at its infinite speed, and then subsequently at each layer that shows itself as light projects itself slower and slower. This also introduces us to the notion of superposition in genetics, because what we're seeing is that as something shows itself at the material layer, and particularly in DNA, it has yet its counterpart that exists in superposed form in more subtle layers of light. And this, in this point of view, this becomes the notion of superposition in genetics. Similarly, we have the notion of entanglement in genetics, because when we think about each of these antecedent or more and more subtle layers of light, it's clear that the way that space-time work in any of these subtle layers is very different. For instance, when light's traveling infinitely fast, then everything exists here, everything exists now. So all of reality is present here and now. And therefore, there's automatically an entanglement which everything is subject to. And as things begin to precipitate, that entanglement already has its play. But then there's subsequent entanglements that also occur as light diversifies, as the information in light diversifies into sets and then into seeds. So there's different kinds of entanglement, and these all must have a bearing even on genetics that occurs at the level of the cell. When we think about heredity, then also we can see that in this notion, when we particularly look at this layer of CN, then there's a number of seeds that already exist. So you can think about a seed for a particular species, and then that diversifying into a larger number of very diverse seeds. But the point being that the function is already determined in these seeds, and that's the basis of heredity. When we think about constructive mutation, then it should be apparent from this matrix that when light, or when some particular mechanism that's occurring at 186,000 miles per second integrates with a faster layer of light, that's the basis of a constructive mutation, because that seed that's expressing itself, if it integrates with antecedent layers of light, then some other positive function can also be materialized or influence what's already materialized. And by contrast, when we think about destructive mutation, then it should be apparent that that's due to the influence of this layer where light's projected at zero speed, and where the reality has to do with basically fragmentation, darkness, weakness, inertia, chaos. And so when we think about something going wrong or something degenerating at the level of our genes, we may hypothesize that that's due to some kind of integration with this layer of fragmentation defined by C traveling at, or light traveling at a zero speed. So also there's, in this point of view, a different interpretation of matter, because matter then becomes the output of a persistent quantum level computation that is being arbitrated due to existing reality and a number of influences impinged on it from both antecedent higher layers of light and the layer of light where it's projected at zero speed. From this point of view, finally, we can see that just as there was pre-genetic code that exists perhaps in the material fabric, and genetic code we can also see that due to persistent quantum level computation, we may reach a reality of post-genetic code, which is some hybridized structure that perhaps has subtle elements also as part of it, as depicted by this light matrix. So essentially what's being pointed to here is a number of areas of further research in genetics. And my only objective with this paper and this presentation was to suggest a different reality or an enhanced way to think about genetics. And if we can think about genetics from this point of view, then also it opens out a lot of avenues for the kinds of research to do with the integration of light and genetics. Incidentally, I did receive a Best Presenter award for this presentation at this conference, and I just wanted to mention that, you know, while I've been giving presentations on cosmology of light and particular applications, this was the first Best Presenter award that I got in this. So this actually occurred 9 to 12 September of this year. And so that was for me a milestone. All right. So welcome to the Cosmology of Light channel. And I'm Praveer, and I have my colleague Lalita also on this live stream call. And we are going to go over this presentation, this paper and presentation that we co-authored and co-presented at the 11th annual IEEE Information Technology, Electronics, and Mobile Communication Conference just a couple of weeks ago. And this paper was titled The Fourfold Properties of Light and Its Relevance to Quantum Computation. So to get us started here, I'm just going to go over the structure of this presentation. I'm going to start with a light-based model, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lalita, who will essentially walk us through the rest of these sections, including quantum superposition, entanglement, tunneling, annealing, and then also concluding, summarizing and concluding. And it'll be a spontaneous conversation as we go through it, but we're going to share the content as we share it in the presentation, and then also have some spontaneous conversation along the way. So with that, I'm going to introduce this light-based model. And for those of you who have been following the Cosmology of Light channel, you'll see that this is a familiar model, but I'm going to break it up. And essentially the way to think about it is that it's a multi-layered symmetry-based model of light. And the starting point is this top row in this matrix, which is denoted by C with the subscript infinity, which really implies that light in its native state is traveling infinitely fast. So let's just think about that for a minute. If light were to travel infinitely fast, and if we assume that we have some kind of volume, then if we have a light source at the center, essentially light's going to be present in that whole volume instantaneously, so it's going to have a property of presence. Now, if something not of the nature of light were to arise, then light would subsume or overpower it, and therefore there's also this property of power. Since light exists in this entire volume, anything that appears or disappears in its fabric is going to be instantaneously recorded, and so light has a knowledge, and so there's a property of knowledge that also arises. And since everything exists in this fabric of light, there's a harmony that also exists, and therefore there's a property of harmony. So just through this simple thought experiment, we've derived, in a sense, these four properties of this conceptual space where light travels infinitely fast. And so that's the starting point of this light matrix. Now, as we go down to the second row in this matrix, this is actually a quantization function. And what it's saying is that the reality that emerges when light projects itself at speed k, which is denoted by the subscript k in the third row here, is some function of the reality that already exists when light travels infinitely fast. And this quantization function, it makes more material these subtle aspects of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And the way that it does that is that it differentiates each of these four properties into large sets where, for example, if we consider knowledge or power, each of these elements get differentiated into sets of almost, practically speaking, infinite elements that have to do, for example, with knowledge or power. So there's a materialization, an increasing materialization of these subtle concepts. And that really is what this row over here denotes. So what you see is these four sets: a set of presence, a set of power, a set of knowledge, and a set of harmony. And then similarly, there's another quantization function that occurs that makes these properties of this reality in light even more material. So what we have here in this third layer, denoted by the subscript n over here, so when light is traveling at some speed n that is higher than our known speed of 186,000 miles per second, but quite a bit lower than infinity, then essentially through this quantization, there's a further materialization of the infinite information that exists in light. And the way that this quantization or this materialization is envisioned to occur is that these four sets that we have, the set of presence, set of powers, set of knowledge, and set of harmony, since they have practically infinite elements in them, in this layer, the quantization is such that there is, you can say, an infinite number of permutations and combinations to create unique elements. And these unique elements are really summarized by this formula over here, where Cn is a function of the elements of essentially the four sets. So you could have infinite number of subtle seeds that are being created. And then the final quantization that is depicted in this matrix is one that we're more familiar with. And that's when light propagates itself at 186,000 miles per second. And that creates the basis of this immense diverse material field that we exist in. But you can see that really the source or the root of that infinite diversity are these infinite number of subtle seeds that exist in some antecedent layer of light. And so before we move forward, there are a couple of things to point out here. One is that I refer to this as a symmetry-based model of light, and it's symmetrical essentially because as we look at each of these subsequent layers, they are all hinged around the four properties of light. So the symmetry is that these four properties exist, but they show themselves in different ways depending on what the speed of light is. So the variable here is speed of light. And as light projects itself at slower speed, we see different aspects of the same four things shown to us in a different way, and therefore it's symmetrical. And I'll make one more point before I hand this to Lalita or for any conversation that we want to have. And that is also that there's a prediction that essentially is coming out of this model. And that prediction is that if we want any kind of robust, complete, sophisticated computation to occur, then it has to be a function of all four of these properties: presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So any kind of robust quantum computational model that emerges, this is predicting that all four of these aspects would have to be present and combined in such a way that in that computational model, these four things that have to do with presence, power, knowledge, and harmony would somehow work together. So let me just pause there. And Lalita, I don't know if you have any comments or anything that you'd like to add at this point.
Sure, Pradeep, thank you. So basically, we are saying that light emerges into other matter forms, like what we see as matter in reality is essentially light propagating itself in these different speed levels and giving rise to all reality that we see. Is that true?
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's true. Yes, and I think that one way in which that practically may happen is that if we think about Planck's constant, then I would, which is perhaps one of the smallest measurable quantities, and it's essentially an integral part of how a quanta or a photon shows itself, because there's a correlation with this Planck's constant. But if we probe a little further and ask what really is Planck's constant, in the this multi-layered light point of view, I would propose there's an inverse proportionality between the speed of light and, in fact, h, which we know as Planck's constant. And so as c becomes more finite, so at 186,000 miles per second, then h becomes a larger value, because if you have c at infinity, then h is zero, being inversely proportional. But when you lower c, then h becomes bigger, and so it reaches a threshold level where matter can form.
Understood. That makes sense, Pravi. And another way to say it is by considering the wave particle duality of light, right? How light shows itself as a wave at some time, and it also behaves as it's a bunch of particles at other times. So, can we talk a little bit about that, Pravi?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's also a really good point you bring up, Lalita, because we, in our current interpretation and understanding of quantum phenomena, we certainly have tapped into this aspect that there's something that's very full that's behind the particle aspect that shows up, and we refer to that as a wave. What this model is even proposing or predicting is that the wave itself is a materialization of something that's even more subtle or even larger. So, in fact, if we look at the fullness of this model, we might be able to say that there is a block field wave particle quadrality, not just a duality, but there's potentially a quadrality that exists, that of which the wave particle duality is so far the measurable part that we've been able to interpret when we try and understand or penetrate into quantum phenomena.
Absolutely.
Should I move forward then?
Yes, yes. So I'll be dealing with the next part of the presentation now. We have discussed so far about the four properties of light and the light-based model, where it exhibits properties such as the presence, power, harmony, and knowledge. Now we will try to apply that model to quantum computing to see if that really holds good, and if we can probably relate it to some examples and understand if this model still holds good. So first property we are going to talk about is the quantum superposition. And a superposition basically means that being in multiple states or existing in multiple places or states at the same time. In classical computing, we are not familiar with this concept. It is all a binary system. We have either a 0 or 1, which we call as bits, and that is the basis of all quantum computing. I'm sorry, classical computing. But in quantum computing, we have something called as qubit, which means it can be 0 or 1 or both at the same time, basically in a superposition of states. So that is, the property of presence that we are relating to, and we can discuss this in detail by taking the famous example or the experiment of the double slit, famous Young's double slit experiment, where we assume a single photon light source and we try to pass that single photon through two slits. And what we see is that this one photon goes through both the slits and records on the screen as a wave. And when we measure it, it will record as a particle. So we are trying to showcase that light exists in two places at the same time, even though we expect it to behave as one. So it is in a kind of superposition and it is proven and recorded. That is the multi-presence or the omnipresence property of light that we are seeing here, which is the core pillar of quantum computing. Quantum computing basically gets its strength or the extraordinary computational ability using superposition and some other properties which we are going to discuss in the further slides. So this is one phenomena which we can relate to this multi-layered model of light, which proves the presence property. So the next property we are going to see is the quantum entanglement. And this is also one of the core pillars which gives quantum computing its true power, because when we deal with any subatomic particles like photons or protons or electrons, if we take any subatomic particles like this and we prepare them in a certain way and then separate those particles by vast distances, like if we take the other particle to the other side of the universe, even then when we perform a measurement on those particles, without any communication, that at this point of time we are going to make this measurement, even if we don't share that knowledge with the other party, the results of those measurements are always 100% correlated. Uh, this kind of shows the power of knowledge sharing. I mean, the particles kind of communicate with each other, share the knowledge with each other's outcomes of measurement, and they kind of correlate 100% of the time. So this shows the knowledge aspect of light, and that's what we discussed as the second, symmetry in the fourfold model of light. So quantum entanglement is also a core pillar, like we discussed, which is giving quantum computing its power, because we don't have to make measurements on multiple particles at the same time. We can make a measurement on one and then we would know what the outcome of the other entangled particle is, and that gives a good computational ability to the computers. So that's the second property. And the third property is quantum tunneling. So we discussed about the power property of light, which basically has the ability to avoid all other forms and manifest itself into other layers of light. So what this tunneling is showing is we have an experiment where we take a particle in a box and we expect that particle to remain in that box and not outside the box when the walls are not infinity. The thickness of the walls is not infinity. But what we see is sometimes when we make the measurement, there is a non-zero probability of finding that particle outside the box, which means light can be present outside the box even when we don't expect it to. It has the power to penetrate and be present at other places, and it has the power to tunnel through these walls and end up being on the other side. So that is the power property of light, and this is a core aspect of quantum computing, which will also connect with the other two phenomena, and it gives the ability of higher computational power. And then last property that we are going to talk about is the quantum annealing, where we talk about harmony in the sense that according to the second law of thermodynamics, we know that everything in the universe tries to be at a minimum energy state. which means, for example, if you take a cup of coffee, hot coffee, and keep it there, it will eventually become cool, and it adjusts itself with the room temperature. So it kind of attains that equilibrium and tries to get into a state of harmony to adjust itself to the surroundings. Same is true with quantum computing, because we have a property called quantum annealing, where we notice that if we assign some weights to the different states of a problem, we assume that different variables are different states, and we assign weights to those states. Universe or nature itself will provide the minimum energy state, and we don't have to do all those computations to find out what is the best possible solution to a given problem. Nature will find it for us, and it will give us the best, most efficient solution to a problem, and that is through quantum annealing. It basically attains a level of harmony, and that is what we are relating to the harmony property of light. This completes the four layers, and we can see different examples of how these four layers work with quantum computing.
Thanks, Lalita. And what also I'll say that there's so I think that the jury is still out, in the sense of our current understanding of these phenomena, whether it's superposition or entanglement or tunneling or annealing, is, I think, just at the surface level. Or I think there's a lot more that potentially, we need to penetrate into and understand, how really what's the dynamics of superposition occurring? I mean, we have some formula at the moment that will give us a sense for how to compute outcomes and things, but really what's the mechanism, what's happening, behind the scenes. And I think that looking at things from this multi-layered symmetry-based model, might provide some additional insight into how to think about these different phenomena. So just one quick example: if we think about superposition, and we have, say, four quantized layers of light that have their own logic and how they show up, and there's a certain kind of quantization that is suggesting that it's now a whole, and therefore it shows up at a lower speed. But the point being is that any particle that shows up at the material layer that we understand it has counterparts, or these subtle kind of information that exists at multiple layers of light, not just in a wave aspect, but if we want to get a little more rigorous about thinking from this point of view of this model, then superposition then becomes almost like four different functions that express themselves materially in an arbitration that's taking place. So the point being is that we can consider each of these different phenomena with a little more kind of detail, or a little more rigor, if there was something like this symmetry-based model of light that we use as a basis. So
yeah, definitely.
And would you like to just summarize and conclude there, Lalita?
Sure. So what we are saying here is we have this fourfold model, like Praveer explained, all these different properties of presence, knowledge, harmony, or power. Yeah. So all these four properties, we are trying to relate those with the existing proven phenomena of quantum computing, and they are exactly matching with these four properties, where we saw the superposition in a practical experiment called double slit, and it is exactly what the all presence property is saying. And we are talking about the knowledge property, where the particles or light should know what is happening throughout the universe, and that is proven through entanglement, and the particles are really communicating and correlating with each other when we make a measurement. And the third property, tunneling, it should exhibit the power property, we don't expect it to show up on the other side of the box or the barrier, but it does, and that is the power that light exhibits, and it correlates perfectly with quantum tunneling. And the harmony property again so symmetrical to the quantum annealing in the quantum phenomena, because it also shows how the more dynamically we have seen in the quantum classical environment, the same exists in quantum world, and all these nature itself provides that harmony and the most effective solution at all times, which relates to the harmony property. So yeah, so that's the summary and conclusion we are trying to arrive at, where we take this four-layered approach and apply it to quantum computing. It fits exactly within the puzzle, and we then propose that this is how we should approach to the next problems, not just as wave particle duality, but the quadrality, like Praveer mentioned. We should also take into account this knowledge, this power property, this harmony aspect, along with the superposition and presence. So that will give us the complete picture, is our proposition in this paper.
Thank you. Thank you, Lalita.